Hello everyone, as always I am Cosmic and today we're going to be reviewing indie space action adventure game Rebel Galaxy, which was developed by Double Damage Games. Now Double Damage themselves are a team of two developers, one being Travis Baldry and the other being Eric Schaefer, who happen to be both co-founders of Runic Games, which are the developers who developed the Torchlight series. The pair have also worked on games such as Fate and Diablo in the past. Now I actually previewed the game earlier in the year and the preview build left a very good impression, but there were some issues and I certainly had some skepticism as to the scalability of the title. Now the premise of Rebel Galaxy is that you have inherited an old rundown Hammerhead class starship from your Aunt Juno, who is essentially the black sheep of the family. She leaves a cryptic message to meet her out in the frontier of the universe, but has then disappeared upon your arrival. The game has a very Western in space motif, which as a fan of Firefly I absolutely adore. A combination of country rock and country music plays as you warp your way through the star systems, coupled with great visuals, makes for one of the best atmospheric rides possible. Considering the small team that built this game, they have accomplished an impressive feat both graphically and audibly, with some fairly good voice work thrown in there for good measure. Now something I really like about the game is that the game doesn't force you down a linear progression path. While the game is very limited in some respects, the way you want to proceed and progress is up to you. You can be a fighter, you can be a bounty hunter, a miner or a trader. It doesn't make you more combat orientated if you prefer to shoot lasers at all. Now let's get down to the mechanics of the game. So Rebel Galaxy has less of a strategy focus and more of a focus on action combat. While there is certainly a tactical element to the combat, it's more about concentrating on lining up your shots and feeling the impact of getting shot at. Combat is all about broadside engagements, very much like naval combat. Each ship has a various assortment of turret points and broadside ports. You can at any time control either the broadsides or the turrets to manual fire, but most of your damage will come from the broadside torpedoes. Turrets have a 360-degree firing arc, which is very useful for both keeping up the pressure on a capital ship's shields or fighting off the small but very manoeuvrable enemy fighters. The controls of the game are fairly simple and the game is designed primarily for a gamepad, and while the keyboard and mouse controls are sufficient to truly maneuver correctly in battle and get the optimum experience, it is worth dusting off that old gamepad. The controls are intuitive and it feels very satisfying to pull the trigger and fire off your proton torpedoes. While there are some camera issues in the combat with the preview build in particular, especially when you were trying to aim the broadsides, this has actually now been addressed and the actual camera works much more smoothly than it did in the preview build. The keyboard and mouse controls are a little bit more finicky, however the game does play without any issues with a gamepad. Combat itself can range wildly in difficulty, and it is entirely possible to run into enemies that are way beyond your capabilities. Pulling a Han Solo style escape by veering slightly to the left is a completely legit way to end an engagement. That's if your hull doesn't buckle. Most missions you pick up will give a risk rating that gives you an idea of how difficult the mission will be and thus how difficult the combat will be. High risk, however, does often mean high reward. There are a variety of enemies, usually grouped into factions, and each faction has an assortment of different class ships, plus factions tend to focus on different weaponry. Combat can often turn from a well planned out engagement to utter chaos, especially in a battle where there are tens of units on each side. Often you can aid other factions in battles, which can create some truly spectacularly looking battles. In fact, I haven't seen a game do missiles, laser beams and turret fire in space so well since probably EVE Online. Unlike many space games, you actually don't start out in a single fighter like I've said. You start out in a frigate, so the progression is slightly different from other games. Enemies will often have scores of smaller fighters to wear down your shields, so it's often best to utilise hired help. Now the game does allow you to hire a single mercenary to fight alongside you in battle. There are a lot of different mercenaries available to choose from, and having one along for the ride can just be fun as well as helpful. However, their pathing sometimes doesn't react to where you're heading, causing a Galaxy Quest style paint scratch event to occur. All ships have shields and hull strength, and both must be destroyed to eliminate the ship. Some weapons are more effective against a certain type, however loadouts should be configured to your style of play. Do you go for long range missiles or high damage short range beams? It's completely up to you. Ships also have the use of a short booster for getting out of tight points such as an oncoming asteroid, and a deflector shield that can be activated in short bursts to absorb extreme damage. I think the combat overall is enjoyable and well balanced. Fighting in asteroids fields can be problematic, especially when the camera is not looking in the direction that you're flying, but you tend to get into the habit of regularly checking the radar. Fights are fast paced and very high octane, and the tougher engagements can be very satisfying to win. There is some negotiation in the game, however responses are very limited, and most of the interesting conversations do take place in the main storyline rather than from the random encounters. It's one of those things that, yes, it is kind of nice to have the negotiation in there, however it lacks that much depth that, to be honest, the game wouldn't miss it if it was just completely removed altogether. On the progression side of things, money is king. There are a variety of ships available to purchase at the various space stations that you will come across, and some factions and guilds do have specialty ships and equipment in stock to purchase. Ships are very customizable in terms of their equipment, and everything from weaponry to engines can be changed out. Now the game does take place over several star systems, so more ships, equipment and tiers of equipment will become available later on. Higher class ships and equipment do cost an arm and a leg, so grinding the side missions will be crucial to staying ahead of the curve. Some items will require you to have a certain rank of reputation in order to be able to purchase them, which will require grinding out missions for that particular faction. Gaining enough money for the better equipment and better ships and the higher tier items, let's not dance around it, it is a ton of a grind fest. Side missions are usually fairly enjoyable, but they do tend to be reused missions, just they swap out the names and the factions and the locations. While the missions are rehashed content, the randomly generated universe that is filled with junkyards, ice fields and random events such as distress calls and pirate attacks do tend to keep things interesting. The grind of progression could put some people off, and I could see why. It does take a long time in some cases. However, the combat alone, due to the fact that it's hands-on, does keep you engaged. What does not keep you engaged, however, is the sheer amount of time that is spent travelling between locations. While warp engines can be upgraded to go faster, each solar system is pretty huge, and it can take several minutes to get from one side to the other, which would be okay, but there isn't that much to look at. An engaging warp itself can also be a source of unending frustration, as you can run into unforeseen stellar debris that will stop you from warping, meaning that you'll have to impulse your way out of range and then enter warp again. And if you're in the middle of a quite large asteroid field, this can happen several times, which becomes really frustrating and really boring and ultimately very time consuming. That all being said, overall, Rebel Galaxy has turned out to be one of the indie gems of the year. Its fun, engaging combat and stylish aesthetic has produced a wonderful space action game with a decent, if a little cliche storyline to boot. There is very little to complain about in Rebel Galaxy, and even littler when you consider the size of the team who made such a huge game. The price tag at $20 is an absolute steal, and frankly, for the content and quality that is actually in this game, I would probably have paid much more. I definitely recommend this game as one you should not even wait for, that you should just go and buy. However, if you do have to wait, make sure you do pick it up soon in a Steam sale, because this is definitely one that you should add to your collection. And that was my review of Rebel Galaxy. Thank you so much for watching and listening. Do like, subscribe and leave a comment, and I will see you next time.